Hello, welcome to this week's sermon. This is a sermon for Sunday, the 9th of June 2024. That will be the 10th in Ordinary Time, Year B. The readings, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 11 and 19 and 20. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 13 to chapter 5, verse 1. And Mark's Gospel chapter 3, verses 20 to 30. It had to come at some time, and eventually it did. The people wanted to be like other nations around them and have a king. They'd rather conform than be distinctively different. It's just easier to blend in with the rest. It's a struggle to be different, even when the result of being different is better. God assures Samuel that it's not his fault. It is not Samuel who is being rejected by this request, but God himself. So Samuel warns them that having an earthly king will mean, well, this is what it will mean for them, he says. Men declaring wars, which others have to fight and die in. Hard labour in the fields, from which others will take the profits. Now, some of the kings they got weren't too bad. David was the greatest of them all, despite his acts of adultery and conspiracy to murder between writing psalms. Solomon was the wisest, despite his vast harem of foreign wives and his penchant for pagan gods. Hezekiah was the most repentant, pulling Jerusalem out of the fire at the 11th hour with a spot of sackcloth and ashes. And Josiah was the greatest reformer and patron of the temple since Solomon's day, despite his occasional balmy military forays, which resulted in his early demise. But most of the rest were hopeless. They were corrupt, hypocritical, and inept. Throughout most of history, in most countries, the political leaders have been about as bad. The truly effective and good leader has been the exception rather than the rule. Now, let's not be too critical of our political leaders. Statecraft is such a difficult art that they are almost bound to fail at some point. Perhaps this fear of impending and inevitable failure accounts for so many of them over the centuries turning into despots who have caused the deaths of millions, enslaved countless others, and been the ruination of people's homes, work, and dreams. The fear of impending failure has prompted them to remove the possibility of criticism. Some have managed to achieve mayhem on their own, whereas most have relied on an oligarchy of a few privileged cronies from their own tribe, class, town, or club. This is still true today in more countries than I have time to list. Dominic Sandbrook has published a book looking at the 2010 David Cameron government, and the UK is better than many places on earth, in which he concludes his evaluation of the British political scene in the following excoriating terms. He writes, "At the heart of all this is a cancerous culture of materialism, greed, and self-interest." In our passage from 2 Corinthians today, Paul seems to be suffering at the hands of the political authorities. He says he doesn't lose heart, which indicates there are grounds for his doing so. Outwardly, he is wasting away, and his present afflictions will pass. But clearly, it is only his inner faith and fortitude that are keeping him going. What has brought him into such conflicts with Roman and Jewish authorities? Well, it is his determination to challenge them with a higher authority. He believes in the eternal victory of Christ. He trusts in the heavenly tent which awaits him when his earthly tent is no more. This gives him an eternal perspective to judge this world. St. Paul voices the radical Christian perspective. We fix our attention not on things that can be seen, but on things unseen. What can be seen lasts only for a time, but what cannot be seen lasts forever. That would be a hard sell for any politician, but it is a perspective which should guide what politicians seek to achieve within the realm of the visible and the mortal. Paul sounds very much like Jesus, who said, "Do not store up riches on earth, and you cannot serve both God and money, and it is much harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle," and so on. Elsewhere, Paul may ask Christians to pray for the emperor and authorities. He is saying that any government that provides stability and peace for its citizens is better than no government at all. He is not thereby endorsing all that the emperor is doing. Paul knows that the alternative to bad government is not necessarily good government. Too often the alternative to bad government turns out to be no government, as we have seen from Yugoslavia, Iraq or Afghanistan, to name but some of the recent attempts at regime change. There are some pretty grisly dictatorships and ineffective governments around the world today, but they are better than the total collapse of civil order, such as we have seen in Haiti this year. Paul can pray for the emperor, at whose hands he would eventually lose his life, because he didn't take politicians as the ultimate authority. He calls on a power beyond their power to redeem and guide them. Paul and the other apostles believe that in Jesus, the world had at last got a king worthy of such a title. Christians stood apart from other citizens of the Roman Empire. The emperor, the empire, their own lives were all important to them, but each was subordinate to the rule of Christ, even their own self-interest. This belief in the true kingship of Christ was a very important part of the Christian gospel in the early days. It was a restoration to how things had been before Samuel had been forced to find them a king in the Old Testament. It was also highly subversive and dangerous. One of the first things the Roman state learned about this new religion was that it involved following a new king other than Caesar. They refused to worship Caesar. The political angle of their new faith led many Christians to suffer the atrocities of the arena or crucifixion. It has always been a threat to the world to have people who owed greater allegiance to Jesus than to the state. That is why Christianity has been so frequently outlawed, as it is today effectively in so many countries. In whose interest is it, do you suppose, when children are raised to believe that there is no greater personal power in the world than their political leaders? But Paul could accept the less than perfect political powers of his day because he believed that ultimately they could be held in check if, the emperor included, acknowledged the ultimate lordship of Christ. Christ is the supreme Lord of Lords, who gives unity to the fractured world, divided by politics, religion, ethnic hatred, and economic self-interest. If the rulers of the world came to acknowledge the lordship of Christ, the Prince of Peace and Justice, they would rule their citizens in a far better way, he argues. Paul wanted to turn the political world upside down, but not by bloody revolution, but by evangelism. Our passage from Mark 3 reveals the fears Jesus had for how those in political power were running things in his day. The controversy over Jesus and Beelzebub, or the devil, arose because it was beyond dispute that Jesus exercised some kind of extraordinary power. He spoke with authority, far exceeding that of the scribes and the Pharisees, and had the ability most politicians can only dream of, to change people's views and allegiances almost instantly. He acted with extraordinary, incomprehensible power to cure the sick, even raise the dead. He walked on water, fed the hungry, and turned water into wine. Would that be enough to remind them that there was a greater power at work in this universe than their own? For those who knew him at the time, both opponent and supporter, it was only a question of by what power and authority he did such things, and to what end. He was demonstrating his moral authority over the world, but his opponents accused him of working with the devil to perform such deeds. They saw Jesus as a rival to their political power. Jesus rejected those accusations in terms that are about the harshest Jesus ever used. Normally, Jesus spoke of forgiving 70 times 7, but on this occasion, he spoke darkly about the unforgivable sin. The unforgivable sin is to witness the power of Jesus at work, healing the sick, raising the dead, feeding the hungry, and defending the oppressed, and describing that work as evil. What is going on here? Why is this the unforgivable sin? Well, those who accused Jesus of working with the devil were opposed to the claims they heard people making about him. They did not agree with those who said that he was the Messiah. They did not like him replacing their authority with his own. They did not like the way he overturned or reinterpreted the laws of Moses. But in their desire to disagree with Jesus, they went as far as calling the manifestly good things he did evil. There can be no safe, stable, just society if people willfully confuse good and evil for the sake of winning a political or religious argument. All hope for humanity is lost if we can no longer agree on what is good, or when we refuse to acknowledge the truth and goodness in an opposing party. Yet this is where we have arrived today. In many countries, dictators or one-party states coerce people into following their political path. We would expect nothing less, for that is the very essence of dictatorships. But even in the democratic West, we risk falling into the same trap. Reasoned debate has been replaced with angry shouting, name-calling, and deplatforming. Nothing the other guy says has any merit, so you no longer seek to engage in an exchange of ideas, but instead you assume such moral superiority that anyone who disagrees is either stupid or racist or supremacist or colonialist or some other such word ending in "ist." In 2024, we have a record number of the world's citizens going to the polling booths. We have seen India, South Africa and Mexico last week. Britain and the US are in the throes of their campaigns, and Euro elections are still to come this month. Even where elections are fair and open, we are flirting with political Armageddon if we not only disagree with the other side, but viscerally hate them. If we believe that they are ignorant, prejudiced people whose voice should be silenced. In 2024, the world needs to heed very carefully the warning Jesus gave. A house divided against itself cannot stand. If we enthrone our own political opinions and our chosen political leaders in the place where God alone should sit, there is no counterweight to our prejudices, ignorance, or self-interest. Only if we recognise that whichever side we claim as our own, there are still things to learn, truth to discern, and goodness to seek beyond what we currently know. Since 1945, there have been many small wars, the rise of global terrorism, several attempts at bloody regime change, collapse across the communist world, and enduring corruption among political elites the world over. The fear of nuclear confrontation has protected us from another big war. But with political settlements looking increasingly shaky, and the world's policemen in danger of taking time off to sort out a domestic dispute, the world economic and political stability is in serious jeopardy. Allowing our world to fall again into the abyss would surely be the ultimate unforgivable sin. Amen.